Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Nadia Ali. I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Studies here at Brown University. Welcome to the teach-in on Beyond the Numbers, teach-in on the earthquake in Turkey and Syria. Now I should say that usually I start out our events by saying how delighted I am to welcome our guests. But I have to admit that today I feel that I wished that we did not have to bring everyone together, given the occasion and the content of today's event. We are here, of course, to talk about the earthquakes that struck Turkey and Syria on February the 6th, which so far have led to the death of more than 50,000 people, and numbers are rising daily. At least 2.4 million people have been affected by this disaster. Over hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced, and these are only official numbers, and we suspect that the actual numbers are much higher. While we are clearly looking at an incredible, devastating natural disaster, the aftermath reveals a series of human-made disasters that have contributed to the devastating impact of the earthquakes, and has also very much challenged the attempt to provide humanitarian assistance. So what we want to do today is to do both, to look at the situation in Turkey and Syria, but also discuss the humanitarian needs and the challenges. That means talking about the political context. So at this point, I would like to introduce my colleague and co-organizer of today's event, Professor Adam Levine, who is the director of the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies. Adam, over to you.
Thank you, everyone, and welcome. My name is Adam Levine. I am a professor of emergency medicine and health services policy and practice here at Brown University, and also director of the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies. Our center has a mission to promote a just, peaceful, and secure world by furthering a deeper understanding of human rights and humanitarian challenges around the globe, and importantly, encouraging collaboration between local communities, academics, and practitioners to develop innovative solutions to these challenges. We have several affiliated faculty and global fellows who have lived and worked in Syria and Turkey, including Dr. Tayseer Alkarim, who will be joining us on the panel today. And one of our visiting scholars is currently in Turkey and Syria working on humanitarian relief right now. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to join us today, but we do want to recognize Amani Kadur's efforts with Syria relief and development. Myself, I've responded to humanitarian emergencies in Africa and South and Southeast Asia, and also led research and training initiatives around improving the delivery of humanitarian assistance, though I have not personally worked in Northwest Syria or Turkey. I'm really excited by the incredible panel, though, of individuals we've assembled today, who you'll be hearing more about from Nadia in a second, who will be able to provide a really in-depth understanding of the earthquake and its effects, as well as the current situation with the delivery of humanitarian assistance. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. So I'm going to introduce the speakers in alphabetical order. Tayseer Alkarim is the medical doctor, humanitarian and human rights activist with extensive experience in emergency response to humanitarian crises, including armed conflict, such as in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and more recently, Ukraine, as well as enforced displacement context, particularly in the context of the Middle East, Europe, Africa, and Asia. He is an international fellow at the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies at Brown, and a senior fellow at New York's University's Center on International Cooperation. Dr. Karim now lives in exile in France. Welcome, Tayseer. Jumal Qasim is an MA graduate in international relations in Gaziantep in Turkey. He is originally from Marad al-Numan near Idlib in Syria and has been working in the field of humanitarian aid for the past 10 years. Currently, Juma is an access manager for the local NGO Baha, which delivers support across northern Syria and Iraq. Welcome, Juma. Hello. Evin Cihan. Hello. Evin Cihan is a Kurdish human rights and peace activist from Diyarbakir, Turkey, and daughter of a political prisoner. She has a BA in international relations and political science and an MA degree in human rights law from Istanbul Bilgi University. Cihan has worked voluntarily in different NGOs and projects, mainly concerned with reconciliation, peace, and justice. She has started to make documentary films and has a weekly column in a magazine. Welcome, everybody. Last but not least, we are joined by Fulya Pinar, who is the Al Umran Family Postdoctoral Research Associate here in the Center for Middle East Studies at Brown. Her work as a cultural anthropologist focuses on displacement and solidarity movements in Turkey and the Middle East. Welcome, Fulya. So just a quick word about the structure of the event. Adam and myself will be in conversation with our 4 guests. And then there will be time for Q&A. So we encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar. Okay, over to you, Adam.
Thank you so much. So I have the first question, which we'll be asking of each of you in turn. And we just want to start off by understanding from your own perspective what the current situation is like in the areas of Turkey or Syria where you work or live or have worked and lived, and what are the most pressing humanitarian needs now during this phase of the crisis. And we'll start with Dr. Tayseer Alkarim.
Yeah, thank you very much, Adam, and thank you for the opportunity to be with you today to highlight the humanitarian situation in Syria on February 6. The effects of this earthquake are severe and will continue to worsen the already fragile humanitarian situation for a long time. This is not only because of the chronic vulnerability and fragility of the humanitarian crisis in Syria, and of course the failure of the international community and the Turkish government to respond to this disaster in timely manner. As you know, in such a disaster, the timing of the response is one of the most critical factors. Understand the needs in the affected areas in Syria, it is important just to take step back and look at the humanitarian crisis in these areas before the earthquake. What began in March quickly turned into brutal violence, as you know. So this violence has so far more than 500,000 civilians, wounded more than 2 million, displaced more than 13 million people, half of the country's population before the war, destroyed entire cities, ruined the economy, and stolen the future of so millions of Syrians. For example, in the health sector context in Syria, the military attacks on healthcare, more than 90% of these attacks were perpetrated by the Assad regime and Russia, triggered one of the largest exodus of healthcare providers from the country. For example, by 2016, an estimated 27,000 physicians out of 42,000 physicians in Syria had left. 60% of the public hospitals in Syria have been damaged. 40% of the hospitals in Syria are no longer functional. Similarly, the situation, is devastating in other sectors such as education, shelter, so on. So unlike Turkey, the affected areas in Syria were already extremely vulnerable and fragile, and the earthquake only made the situation much worse. So now data, the earthquake in northwest Syria, this area is under the opposition, left about 5,000 people dead, including 13,000 injured, newly displaced people, and around 15,000 buildings partially or completely damaged. In the regions controlled by Assad regime in the central and to 2,500 injured. However, these figures from the field are not definitive in terms that many of the injured people will not survive, and many, if not all, of the missing people will be found dead. So the devastation of this earthquake once elevated. The other thing, it's important to be aware that the areas affected by the earthquake are controlled by different authorities. In Syria, as you might know, the 10 years of violence has fragmented the country into at least 4 conflicting areas. So the humanitarian situation very depend on which authority and in which areas. So this earthquake has affected 3 areas. One is under the opposition in northwest. Second is the Assad regime controlled areas, and the third is also in northwest. This classification is very important because these regions differ in terms of their capabilities, resources, and recognition scale and speed of the international humanitarian aid arriving in Assad regime-controlled areas were relatively good compared to other areas. For example, 8 rescue teams, in addition to 3 medical teams and 132 air convoys, were delivered into the areas under the control of Assad within the first 72 hours. While no UN humanitarian aid or conveys related to the earthquake response arrived in this area during the first 8 days. So we spent the first 8 days without any support from the UN, unfortunately. And this caused so many lives. Furthermore, the first convoy from the UN reached north on the 4th day of the earthquake. This convoy was already planned in terms that it wasn't specifically intended to help the NGOs are working on the ground to respond to the earthquake itself. Another dimension, yeah.
Maybe if you shut off your video, connection will be better. We keep losing you for a little bit.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So I will try to change my Wi-Fi, and maybe you can give the floor to someone else. Okay.
Okay, sure. Let's go then to Joma next.
Yes. Good evening, good morning in other areas. Thanks for having me in here and giving the opportunity. Since I want to thanks to Dr. Tayseer, he gave a very good briefing on the whole situation across the past 12 years that the conflict have lived through. But I want also to add some points that the earthquake is, it's a national disaster, but there was a human-made disaster by years. So across the numbers and the figures that doctor have passed through, we can see and compare how across the time course of 12 years, the death tolls and the casualties of Syrians have been, compared with this recent one. Moreover, the area is over-exhausted by the ongoing war. So you cannot revive like in general in position held there, like a blow comes and like make it much worse and harder. There are like a lot of damage to the infrastructure that we need also to highlight this, because there is, imagine a road between two cities that before the war, 100 vehicles was passing in it in the same day. But now the case is like, it is doubles, it's 1,000 vehicles. So the pressure over the infrastructure existing is making it even worse than the earthquake, because the existing resources are already suffering because of the urban capacity, is very small. We have an area in northwest of Syria, for example, little province, it's 40 by 60 kilometers distance. And it's almost like Gaza Strip. There's about 4 million Syrians living in it. Over 65% of these people are IDPs. So you can imagine the movement and mobility of the IDPs within this area itself. This didn't come by the earthquake or by one day or night, but it happened through 12 years of suffering, besiegement, deportation of certain areas, siege on certain area in eastern Ghouta, in north of Homs, in Dar'a, in Ma'addamiya, Daraya, several parts of Deir ez-Zor, eastern Syria, and also Aleppo city in 2016. So it was like unfortunate, pardon me for using the word, but that's how people like are portraying it. It's like a human dump that Assad used to do. Okay,
I think we've lost Joma, but let's go back to Tayseer, who can speak to us without video currently, and maybe just finish up his piece.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, my voice is much better now. I'm sorry. Yeah, so I was saying that the areas affected by this crisis, this disaster, are controlled by different authorities. And this is very important because the capacity, resources, and even the recognition by the international community and those the response are so different. For example, the scale and speed of the international humanitarian or aid arriving in Assad regime-controlled areas were relatively good compared to the northeast Syria, for example. 8 rescue teams plus 3 medical teams and 132 air convoys were delivered into Assad-controlled areas within the first 72 hours, which is a very good thing, to serve and to save more lives. While no UN humanitarian aid related to the earthquake response arrived in the area of northeast Syria, the areas controlled by the opposition, during the first 8 days. So literally these areas, the organizations working on the ground have been left alone, without fuel, without supplies, without heavy equipment to save lives. And unfortunately, this delay in the response cost so many lives in the area. The other thing, in contrast to the response in Turkey and areas controlled by the Assad regime, the UN didn't activate any of its mechanisms to respond to this type of disaster in northwest Syria, such the United Nations Disaster Assessment and Coordination Mechanism or the International Search and Rescue Advisory Group. Again, this delay in response cost so many lives in northeast Syria. So getting back to your question, Adam, the answer maybe could be much better just to categorize the needs in these areas in 3 groups. The first one is the typical response to natural disasters, including shelters such as tents, prefabricated or semi-fixed houses, reconstruction of the destroyed buildings, in the health sector to send supplies, medications, equipment, surgical consumables, in the education sector to support schools, to provide psychosocial support, GBV services, and so on. So this is the first group of needs in the area. The second one is to make pressure on the UN and other international and intergovernmental organizations to change their approach, to the humanitarian crisis in Syria, and maybe take stronger actions to stop this weaponization and politicization of the humanitarian aid, because we saw this during this disaster of the earthquake. The third group of these needs, is to put kind of pressure on the Turkish government to protect Syrian refugees. As you know, in Turkey, there is more than 3.5 million refugees. Most of them are living, most of them are living on the border between Syria and Turkey. It's the same areas of the earthquake. Syrian refugees in Turkey are among the most vulnerable and least protected groups affected by this earthquake. So most of them, who they were living in these 10, 11 cities, they lost their family members, shelter, jobs, resources, access to education and health, etc. So the uncontrolled racist and criminalization campaigns we are seeing now in Turkey against the Syrian refugees are really serious and could turn into organized violation against these people. So I think this is the most important things we need to figure out how to respond to, and to provide some support to the affected people inside Syria and for Syrian refugees in Turkey. Thank you. Over.
Thank you, Tayseer. Let's go next to Evan, and maybe it will be best to keep your video off just to improve the connection. And I apologize to the audience, obviously, when we're doing a direct conversation with individuals based in an earthquake zone, there's going to be difficulties in communication, but we will simply filter our panelists in and out as they regain connection. So maybe Evan can go next, and then we'll bring in Joma after that if his connection is good.
Hi, thank you so much for this opportunity. As you know, we have recently experienced a major catastrophe, an earthquake that directly affected more than 10 cities in Turkey, affecting approximately 40 million people, actually. And more than 50,000 people lost their lives, actually, for now. Thousands of those who lost their lives were buried anonymously because they couldn't be identified or their relatives couldn't be reached. There is distrust in society about the number of people who lost their lives. There are statements by earthquake victims and their relatives that the number of people who lost their lives is much higher than the official figures, actually. On the other hand, according to official source, again, 18,000 buildings collapsed in these cities, and 19,000 buildings were identified as urgently to be demolished, which means thousands and millions of people were suddenly left homeless. And the most urgent need actually right now is still shelters. Some survivors quickly left the area. Some of them are still standing by the rubble waiting for their relatives, sadly, to be pulled out or at least to receive their bodies. In a considerable part of the geography affected by the earthquake, people were doing livestock. And these livestock breeds who survived do not want to leave their animals behind or say that they have no other choice. Therefore, they continue to stay in destroyed village and towns, actually, still. And yeah, And also some people concerned about the settlements policies and do not want to leave even though their settlements have been destroyed. So when all this comes together, the most urgent need is still a region is still tense. So in the first few days of the earthquakes, tents did not reach anywhere. There was a lot of discussion about why the military, the armed forces did not go to the field and rescue people from the rubble, why they didn't help with basic needs such as tents, and it is still being debated. And today it's 22 days after the first major earthquake. There are still many people and regions where tents have not been delivered. As a matter of fact, people need to stay in the safer and healthier shelters, such as containers rather than the tents now. Tent cities and container cities have started to be built, but the pace of construction is still slow and their numbers are insufficient. So tents should have been only the first aid solution in the first days, but instead of organizing all this in the first days of the earthquake, they closed university across the country by switching to distance education and evacuated the university students from the dormitories and forced the earthquake victims to stay in the student dorms in completely different cities and under unreasonable conditions. So, and also yesterday, it was revealed that AHBAP, which is one of the most popular and well-known charity organization in Turkey, bought 2,050 tents from the Red Crescent. On the first day, with the donation it collected for the earthquake. So defensive statement was made that this was a legal method, but in fact the Red Crescent is an organization that is sustained by the taxes of everyone living in this country and is obligated to provide tents and the necessary materials to the places and people in times of need. Since yesterday, this huge scandal continued to be discussed. On the other hand, political parties and non-governmental organizations and volunteers on the ground are reporting that there are still not enough toilets, showers, or cleaning facilities. The need for toilets and shower is also vital for women and children. Women in many areas say they feel uncomfortable with only one toilet being used by both men and women. Local women also report that because too many people use the few toilets do exist, personal hygiene-related disease have started to spread actually. In addition, since there are fewer women on the front lines in the field, female earthquake survivors cannot easily go and get their sanitary pads from aid centers that having been said, and feminist organizations and activists quickly organized and sent purple trucks on the earthquake zones. Now feminist activists take the turns to volunteer in the purple tents they set up in the earthquake zones. And the care work of earthquake survivor women continues even after the earthquake. Therefore, women and children are more burdened than ever. It's also possible to encounter security problems and cases of violence from time to time. And there is also a big question in the public opinion about where the children who lost their relatives in the earthquake area taken to and what kind of structures they should be kept in. There have been public reports that rather than to state institutions, the children were taken to the shelters of various associations and foundations that have close ties to the government. So as in every war and natural disaster, unfortunately, women and children and people in need of care face more threats actually. And again, besides shelter, heating is still a serious problem. Food does not reach everywhere and everyone. clean water was sent in large quantities in the first days, but now it's run out and there is still no access to clean water in many places. Local volunteers are making calls for clean water. And in the very first few days, too many people died under rubble due to the cold and or delayed response due to the insufficient number of search and rescue teams and lack of equipment, sadly. And there are again calls and announcements from all the earthquake zones that people who were pulled out alive from the rubble have disappeared and still cannot be found today. And the right to burial has been severely violated in this whole process. People couldn't bury their relatives according to their beliefs and values. Economic support is vital for thousands or millions of people who have lost everything. But how this aid is currently managed and how it will be managed is another matter, actually. Yeah, for now.
Thank you so much, Evan, for that perspective. Joma, are you able to talk now?
Yes, hi, back. The catastrophe amount that we have seen, and just like conjuncting on what Dr. Tayseer have said, now the current amount of the IDPs in collective centers in northwest of Syria are 55,000 people. There are around 189,000 people, including children, women, and also people with disabilities in general within their relatives' houses, normal camps, or like collective center altogether. So it's almost 2,100 people. There are also Syrian refugees returning from Turkey back to Syria because of the earthquake. Over 2,500 people have been registered, and it's ongoing with increase. Most of the people will be returning back to the area, but not to the destroyed houses. That's what we are forecasting within the few months to come. Probably we will have an increase in camps numbers. CCCM cluster, which is like under UNHCR for Northwest Syria hub of the UN agency, doing the coordination for camps, registered 1,902 camps before the earthquake. Probably will have a peak to come in terms of the number of tents and camps people will go to. There are over 1,290 houses destroyed entirely, and there's above 11,000 houses with the cracks and with an inhabitable situation or level. Over 1,040,000 people in Northwest Syria have been impacted by the earthquake. 323 schools have been destroyed. 58 medical facility have been impacted. So many other also NGOs offices, NGO workers have passed away. Markets, mosques, ATUs. What I want to say in terms also of the response, unfortunately, the first 8 days, there was an entire absence of everybody. This area doesn't have a central government or institution that can deploy all the forces to one area when a crisis happens. This area has been living in a crisis for 12 years. It has been bombarded, sieged, gassed by chemicals, COVID-19 pandemic, and it's a heap of an accumulation of ongoing crises, and that was the last thing Syrians wanted as of the last earthquake. Anyhow, around till now, 263 UN trucks have passed from Turkey to Syria. 85 of them came from Bab al-Hawa. And on the 12th day, there was a UN Security Council resolution and consultation on opening 2 other gates, because we know there is an annual or like half annual vote in the United Security Council, the United Nations Security Council, for the cross-border aid shipment. And unfortunately, there is a lot of politics on that. So everyone like is trying to help and do his best in terms of the response. All Syrian NGOs, Turkish NGOs, and agencies are going now inside Syria. I have been escorting so many journalists from Washington Post, NPR, Daily Telegraph, German TV, Japanese national TV, etc., and so many other also international doctors who came to help and assist. But that was very late after like the first 2 weeks. So already all their search and rescue efforts are already over, because it's not, you know, how to say, like by calculations, no one could survive this under the rubble. And it was only the White Helmets, which is like a group of Syrians who it's like a civil society organization, and they are the frontliners within every crisis, like bombardments, fires, or even this earthquake response. But their resources is like really limited. So they had some diggers, excavators, and bulldozers across some of the towns, but they stayed for even 4 days continuously with all their capacity, trying to help search and survive. There were no zero dogs for rescue and help. They had no like advanced technology or sonars or ultraviolet or infrared technologies to search and help. There was more than 90 teams coming from there are more than 90 teams coming from over 90 countries to help the rescue and search efforts in Turkey. But no one, you know, like came literally inside Syria. Only like 3 Spanish volunteers came from Bab el Hawa on the 5th day, but then they returned like 3 days later with, you know, like without much effort. People feel here that they are really neglected, they are abandoned, no one is like looking after it, as if it is, you know, the other, in a different planet, or like it's from the other part of the world. Sorry to take longer time, but I'd ask Emily to go through the photos, because it shows the amount of damage, the rescue. Most of the people, as you see here, are like normal civilians who are coming to help with even like very, how to say, primitive tools, shovels and hammers, to try to dig the blocks and the concrete to extract their beloved ones. And then moreover, the current efforts of NGOs are scaling up in a very, you know, notified way, but it's already too late. In terms of shelter and all sectors, I will just stop by this point. In my first answer to the question, there were, as I said, 1,902 camps. Now it's increasing. Over 1.6 million people live under tents since like so many years. I met some beneficiary within our work who have been displaced for the 12th time in a row. People are destabilized. They keep moving because of, you know, feel of insecurity and other conditions. The people are demanding is to have you know, more dignified shelter. So as my colleague just said a while ago, in Turkey people are asking for container or a prefabric containers. Similarly, the people here are asking the same, because, you know, tents are, the people cannot be living under a piece of a cloth within the cold, heat and hot weather conditions forever. People need like to have a more dignified shelter facility, and already they have been suffering for a long time. And also all the services profile in different sectors, I said, people have found and are living the shortage in. Apologies.
Thank you, Gemma. And then last, let's go to Fulya.
So thank you for inviting me, and thank you to the other panelists. I really learned a lot from you. So I'll respond immediately to the second part of the question. on the pressing needs, and then we'll open this more. Evin already mentioned many important issues, so I won't restate those. Just adding to Evin's points, one of the very pressing needs in Turkey right now, and also I believe in Syria too, is sustained long-term help, specifically designed for rebuilding the lives and living spaces of different groups of people, like, for example, specifically designed help to single mothers, LGBT people, children whose parents could not be found, refugees, minorities, disabled people. And for this, supporting local activists and occupational organizations, unions, and independent and reliable news outlets and experts is extremely important. So turning to the question in its entirety, I am from Eastern Turkey, Malatya. My father's side, my three sisters were all born and raised in Malatya, and I lived there also for about 5 years. My mom is from Elbistan, a town of Marash, one of the epicenters of the earthquakes. Her family lived there for hundreds of years. In Malatya, more than 300 buildings completely turned into rubble, and most others were also highly damaged. Most of Elbistan is gone. I also previously conducted research in Hatay, Antep, and Kilis with refugee people. All these places are impacted highly. Especially the smaller cities, towns, villages are really impacted because help did not arrive for days in many of them, like my colleagues also mentioned. So the Disaster and Emergency Management Directorate, AFAD, under the Ministry of Interior in Turkey, did not arrive to especially the smaller towns and villages for many days, for 7-8 days in some places. And when they did arrive, they did not have sufficient equipment like lifting cranes, and many people froze to death under the rubble or died because of hunger. So many survivors not moving away from the disaster sites for the first days. They stayed and tried to remove their families, their neighbors, their friends from under the rubble themselves. They used WhatsApp, Twitter to communicate and coordinate these needs. So this local independent struggle from the very beginning of this should be emphasized. This was very powerful. And second, the government tried to prevent alternative organizations of aid and solidarity from going to these places to provide help. This goal of centralizing disaster relief slowed down, prevented the process. Still, so many solidarity organizations took place, occurred during this time, building connections in informed, considerate ways and providing specifically designed support to different groups of people. So what is needed the most right now is supporting these local struggles in more sustained, more longer term manner. Survivors not only live in the impacted areas now, but they also moved to other safer parts, struggling to rebuild their lives in these new spaces. Like many from Adıyaman went to Konya, for example. Many others went to Ankara, sometimes sharing the same house as multiple families. There are so many wonderful grassroots organizations in Turkey who have already been doing long-term work in all of these places, both the places impacted by the earthquake, but also the places where survivors now moved to. There are occupational organizations, unions, agricultural cooperatives, women and LGBT organizations, and minority and refugee organizations. So helping these organizations to sponsor the education, housing, and specific needs for the women and LGBT survivors, as I said, single mothers, disabled people, refugees, minorities, would be very much needed in the following months. So committing longer-term donations, longer-term supports in maybe smaller amounts to such long-term organizations, such invested, committed organizations, maybe providing $20 a month to sponsor a child's education, a family's monthly meals, supporting the rents of the LGBT people, refugee people. So these kinds of things are all needed, and these all require, as I said, a long-term commitment. In general, I would say, I would recommend people to just ask people from these countries how they can support these local organizations, communities in these sustained ways. One-time help is great and very useful, but sustained help is not only about surviving, but also about living, building a new life for a lot of people. So one pressing need is this, in short, this sustained help. Another significant issue is rebuilding the impacted parts in healthier, safer ways, while mirroring the rich histories and cultural complexities of these sites, and especially places like Hatay, where you have a lot of historical cultural sites, like very old churches of minority communities. The government is making promises like rebuilding entire Hatay in a year, but this will only need to lead to other series of bad decisions regarding people's safety and well-being. Also, this kind of a too fast rebuilding will only reinforce disaster capitalism and just add to the wealth of the already wealthy construction companies, and it will push the survivors to become in heavy debt under such a disaster. Instead, the rebuilding should be respectful, long-term, and with the involvement and welfare of the local communities in mind. There are many activist groups and professional occupation-based organizations, as I mentioned, like the Union of Chambers of Engineers and Architects in Turkey, and there are great geophysics experts in Turkey. So these groups, these people evaluate realistically and considerately how long it will take to rebuild these places, and in what ways they should be done, where exactly in these places they should be done, considering the safety of the people, the safety of the space for, the future earthquake possibilities. So supporting these activist organizations and these occupational organizations is very necessary. And lastly, supporting the reliable news outlets and researchers like journalists, geophysicists, social scientists who have been committed to these impacted parts for a long time, who produce knowledge on the real experiences in the region instead of the ones that make government propaganda is very, very important. So subscribing and donating to news outlets like Duvar, Biyanet, Evrensel, Bir Gün, KRT, BBC Turkish, 1+1, these kinds of news outlets, supporting them is very important, and supporting the long-term committed geophysicists and social science experts, following them, funding their work is also very important.
Great, thank you so much, Fulya. And back to Nadia.
Thank you, Fulya. Thank you, everyone. So one thing that has come across from all of you is that however devastating the earthquake itself was, there was a history, there's a context, there's a before that already contributed to the aftermath being as horrible as it is. And I think that both Tayseer and Juma made this very clear in the context of Syria. And I guess I want to now follow up with both Evin and Fulya, maybe starting with Evin, to ask you, Evin, and maybe you can try with your camera on first to see if we can see you and hear you well. So what, according to your view, Evin, are the current obstacles, whether these are logistic, legal, political, economic, or social, to prevent the kind of humanitarian assistance that is needed right now? And I'm going to then ask the same question, everyone, but let's start with you, Evin.
We have been talking about consequences of excessive centralization in Turkey for many years, actually. And for many years, we have been experiencing several consequences of one color, one language, one politics, and it's monism, and rather than the common mind, actually. So unfortunately, with this earthquake disaster, we have once again experienced the tragic consequences of managing everything with decision taken from a single center. This is the biggest problem. In areas where experts have been warning several earthquakes for many years, And localities should have already had sufficient stocks of tents and search and rescue teams and materials. But in the first 48 hours of the disaster, we realized that even basic excavations and construction materials were not available in these cities. For a long time, everyone waited for the government aid to arrive. But when they realized that no one was coming, and everyone started renting cranes and vehicles from big cities, like from Istanbul, with their own means, so hoping to rescue their relatives. In the first days of the earthquakes, it was snowing in the region, and the roads were already closed. And even the vehicles rented by the people with their own means had to wait in long queues and on the roads blocked by snow, when every minute counted. So also today, volunteers still are calling for pickup trucks, smalls, and etc. from the local communities. And small vehicles are still needed today to distribute aid to the village. On the other hand, some roads collapsed due to earthquakes. The runway cracked at Hatay airport, and the warning made actually for years by Mücella Yapıcı, who is currently imprisoned in Bakırköy prison in connection with the Gezi trial, and by the also Union of Chambers of Engineers and Architects in Turkey, TUMOP, were painfully realized. And the cities and airports and highways were built on ground whose physically and natural conditions were not suitable, actually. And the people had to pay the heaviest price. And we are still faced with the political mind that tries to cover up all this by saying we were not prepared for this earthquake. We were getting prepared for the Istanbul earthquake. So yeah, after the initial shock wore off, people start to organize themselves. Everyone start to collect aid from every corner. People start to mobilize themselves to collect basic needs such as clothes, food, hygienic materials, blankets, etc., anything, and load them on the trucks and send them to the earthquake zone. But at the times the trucks were sized, the justification was mind-bending. The state official wanted to distribute the collected aid in the name of the state. So the trustee was even appointed to the HDP's aid center in Maraş. But later, when this practice caused a lot of reactions among the people, it was not extended much longer. But today, however, there are still very few NGOs and organizations that can officially collect donations. The heavy repressive policies that developed, especially after 2015, put the NGOs under the even more pressure, and with a legal regulation on NGOs in 2020. For example, NGOs in Diyarbakır and neighboring provinces often cannot even access EU funds. For instance, even if their projects are accepted, the funds are confiscated for various reasons. So since the first day of the earthquake, my friends from all over the world have been telling me that they want to help to the local people directly and asking me which NGOs and institutions they can donate to. And we can only address one or two institutions actually now, because this is also very painful. And yeah, today APAP has become one of the biggest and most trusted NGOs in the country. And so much so that there were even a couple of news reports that the trustee would be appointed to APAP as well. So yeah, but condemning us to a single institution actually has the opposite effects on what civil society, what the non-governmental organization actually is. In fact, as we all know, civil society organizations are small organizations and reach a wide variety of groups and localities. But today, we are faced with a system that criminalized almost all NGOs in the country and show us only one NGOs as an address and monopolized and corporatize it actually.
Okay, sorry, we have to come to a close, please. I'm conscious of time.
Yes.
Maybe one last sentence.
Actually, I would like to say something about, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, mostly places were affected by this earthquake was actually also Alevis, Kurds, Arabs, and immigrant and minorities lived, were destroyed. So probably for these reasons, the aid did not and does not go quickly. As a matter of fact, within days, politicians and the public painfully agreed on this. On the other hand, since 2015, Kurdish elected mayors have been systematically arrested and trustees have been appointed in their places. So the trustees also dissolved the elected council members and assemblies of municipalities. So briefly, I can say Turkey is a party on the European Charter of Local Self-Government and must immediately remove its reservation to the charter and implement a strong local government system actually. So the solution, this Kurdish problem, democratization problem, the problem that caused mass destruction such as wars and natural disasters lies in the strong local democracy, but we don't have local democracy here anymore. Yeah, let's say. Now.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you, Evin. Fulya, would you like to add something just for a minute or two?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, centralization, as Evin mentioned, is one of the major obstacles. The government that is trying to collaborate with the companies, with the contractors, with the banks, instead of the local groups who are trying their best with limited resources. The second obstacle is the language barrier, especially for refugees and minority groups. Many refugee survivors could not even have their voices heard during the first days after the earthquakes. And we don't have much knowledge about what happened to them, what happened to minorities who can't speak Turkish in the aftermath of the earthquakes. So we need more infrastructures, more translators, more public workers, journalists, researchers excelled in these multiple languages. And racism is a huge obstacle in Turkey, just like it is done here for Black people. The lootings after the earthquakes were narrated as criminal behaviors of refugees by the mainstream media and some fascist politicians, which then ended up with the provoking of people who then undertook fights within the disaster sites and terrible things like lynching of people. In addition, the government doesn't provide some of the services that it provides to citizens, to the refugees. And this is a huge obstacle because refugees are double, triple displaced at least, and they need much more support than this. And this again connects us to our points about the importance of local organizations, local people being involved in these processes, and reliable news outlets and committed researchers.
Thank you, Fulya. Before I'm going to ask Juma and Tayseer to address the question, which I have already partly done, I'm actually going to read out the two audience questions because they're directly linked to this specific question. So the first one is by Fiza Sarir, who's asking, is the impact of economic sanctions on obtaining humanitarian aid and assistance internationally for earthquake victims in Syria? So that obviously very much links to the questions of obstacles to providing humanitarian assistance. And then Julia Gettel is asking, so she's saying, this is a question for Juma, could you address in more detail why international assistance for the most heavily impacted regions of Syria has been so limited? And please forgive me if you or Tayseer spoke to this earlier as I arrived late. Could you speak about the role of the Assad regime, of the role that the Assad regime has played in this situation? How has the regime handled rescue and recovery operations in impacted areas under their control, like Aleppo? Juma, would you like to go first?
Yes, thank you. Well, in terms of sanctions, and as Folia and other colleagues have commented, we need, like this time, need more social tolerance, more cooperation, more, being hand in hand in solidarity to help everyone impacted by the crisis. But unfortunately, the case is not like this. There is a lot of politics happening in this, whether like in the Turkish side or even in the Syrian side. Since like the early days of the crisis, we are like one of the main partners for several UN agencies, whether WHO, UNICEF, OCHA, and other agencies, and we have been calling for since the first day for more assistance to come, and the only gate was in Bab el Hawa. So for several days from the crisis, the road situation was not, logistically speaking, was not enabling the crossing of shipments because it's only one. And then after that, Martin Griffith tweeted thanking Bashar al-Assad for agreeing on opening Bab al-Salama and Al-Ra'i, two other gates in the north of Aleppo with Turkey, for letting aid to come for the 3 months to come. And literally these areas or these geographies are not under Assad control. So what's the point in here? Even in international law, there's no point of asking a dictator killing his own people for allowing humanitarian aid in a disaster time to get in. Similarly, he went to Oman, and everyone in this regime side was calling and seizing the opportunity, begging on the backs of the woes and agonies of Syrians that left the sanctions on Assad regime. So this opportunist attitude was very widely seen. And there was a lot of gossip and talks about, the Caesar Act, the other sanctions of the EU and US government on Syria is like blocking aid. We are partner of USAID, BHA, Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance. We have been distributing with them in Syria and northwest of Syria since like the second day of the crisis here, in very different and varied products like cash, food, shelter, etc., and wash activities. So this is not true. There is a lot of politics in that. We are working also in the response inside Turkey and also in northwest of Syria, working in both in Hatay province and Kahramanmaraş. And as I said it before, that we need to have more solidarity, more cooperation in these hard times.
Thank you, Juma. Tayseer, would you like to pick up now?
Yeah, sure. First of all, when it comes to the issue of the sanctions, there is no doubt that sanctions made some pressure on the humanitarian assistance and interventions in Syria. But we need to know that this issue has been a good area for political investment by Assad regime. We cannot ignore that all these sanctions has excluded humanitarian aid, in terms that all these funds and the humanitarian assistance from international community and the UN, there is no sanctions of them. So Assad regime starts, from the very first day of the earthquake to invest in this area and saying that, okay, we couldn't respond because we have sanctions. But in reality, most of these areas were the victim of Assad regime itself. It's been bombarded for so many years before the earthquake. Even today, on February 27th, there was a military attack on Idlib, on one of these areas, the most heavily, impacted areas by this earthquake. So, from my opinion, the sanctions didn't impact the humanitarian interventions. And once again, there was some measures from the United States, for example, to facilitate the humanitarian aid and the humanitarian assistance to Syria. So the short answer, no, there is no reasonable or impacts, from the sanctions on the humanitarian aid. The second question is when it comes to this politics about the humanitarian interventions and support from the international community. It's very, very important questions, because first of all, we need to get back to the mandate of the UN and other international organizations. Most of these organizations still recognize Assad regime as the legitimate government of Syria. And this is very important situation. Unfortunately, the UN has failed so big with this, because they still see Assad regime as the representative of Syria, and still delivering billions of dollars to this government, although the UN itself and its teams, human rights groups, have been documented very wide and mass human rights violations, war crimes, and crimes against humanity committed by Assad regime itself. But until today, the UN is still delivering and supporting this government. This regime is still delivering billions of dollars to what they call, in their reports, that this government is involved in mass human rights violations and war crimes and crimes against humanity. So, in brief, the problem is not only about who is getting this humanitarian aid, but it's about the interpretation of the guiding principles of the UN. And behind the UN, there are so many international organizations.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Tayseer and Juma. Adam?
Thank you. So again, we will continue the audience question portion of this teach-in. So please put your questions into the Q&A function, and Nadia and I will ask them of our panelists. We have one question now. So this question goes to mostly Fulya and Evan, and it's about providing health and hygiene material to women and young girls in Turkey, specifically, including sanitary pads and other menstrual hygiene material, as well as any other health material. Are there organizations working on this and ways to support it? And what's the importance of this in particular during this earthquake?
Actually, as I mentioned, there is really few organizations can legally fundraising. Here in Istanbul, feminist activists are trying to specifically focusing on these hygienic materials. And maybe the Diyarbakır Bar Association could be another option for the local one. Yeah. Or Ahbap, I don't know. I'm really sorry, because as I mentioned, it's really hard to also because of the operation and centralization organizing these things here.
Adam, if you don't mind, could I ask Tayseer and Juma to also reflect a bit on the gendered impact of the earthquake in terms of, what are both Fulya and Evan talked about that in the Turkish context, or in the context of Turkey. And I'm wondering whether you could say a little bit about that in the context of Syria. So what I mean is, how are women particularly affected? What are some of the specific needs in terms of security, safety, and so on? Juma, would you be able to say a few words about this?
Yes, for sure. I'm now talking to you from Genderstown. Just today morning, we had a delegation from MSF Belgium with Egyptian and Belgian lady coming from Beirut office responding here, and we have an SRH clinic in here for reproductive health and also for pregnancy, delivery, birth, and such kind of ladies or girls dedicated healthcare. So, you know, unfortunately, first of all, in terms of shelter, there is many hardships for girls and women in terms of privacy in our communities, especially in a bit conservative area. So you have a lot of tents which are like either in a random IDP settlement or in a big camp. They are very close to each other. They cannot be comfortable going to the latrines, like, or even taking a shower or so on. So there are also many other challenges in terms of for the pregnants who many hospitals have been destroyed. So they are traveling for longer distances now to look for the care or like baby delivery or consultancy, etc. Moreover, we have there is so many gender-based violence cases that we are also tracking after the earthquake because of the shake that happened, not physically of the crown, but it's of the social texture within the community. We have also seen some discrimination in terms of aid distribution, like or ignorance of certain groups, including also women. And unfortunately also for the boys and children, they have been away from school, which should be since like 2 weeks they should have went to, but now it's delayed, and this is also making more psychological pressure on them. So these are the challenges that we are facing for women group and other vulnerable groups.
Thank you, Juma. Tayseer, would you like to say something? And I know you wanted to say a few words about the dynamics of the humanitarian crisis in Syria as well.
Yeah, actually, I'm not going to add anything on what have been said because, you know, the problems of women and children are the same. But the problem in Syria, unfortunately, with this insecure environment, you know, these problems became more serious and more pressing on the community. Unfortunately, you know, just like a very basic example, if a lady want to go to a toilet in a camp, you know, she needs like 2 or 3 persons with her, you know, just to ensure that she had the privacy she needs. I'm not talking about sophisticated stuff. I'm talking about the very basic right of any person to get privacy when this person needs to go to a toilet. So unfortunately, the situation is very sad and devastating. And I don't think, you know, after these 10 years, people will be still, you know, able to face more crises, you know, like the one we faced with the earthquake. Yeah. Yeah, when it comes to the dynamics of the war, if I may just clarify this situation, maybe some of the audience, you know, they are not familiar with the situation in Syria. So I just wanted to shed light on two, very briefly, on just 2 factors of the complexity of the humanitarian crisis in Syria. First of all is the dynamics of the conflict. Syria is not a simple civil war. Instead, it's a complex mix of interstate and intrastate conflicts. The conflict driven by complex intersections between local, regional, and international actors have also divided the country into areas of control. Institutional fragmentation hasn't only intensified the humanitarian crisis in the country, but has also created a dilemma on how to respond and how to deal with this heavy politics about the crisis in Syria. As you know, now the Syrian landscape has been divided for years now by at least 4 conflicting authorities. Assad regime from one side, opposition in northwest, the national army supported by the Turkish government in the northwest as well, and the Kurdish authorities in the northeast. So now we don't have one Syria to discuss the humanitarian crisis in Syria. We have so many areas of control. Each of these areas of control has several millions of civilians and also has its own governance structures, institutions, access to international aid, diplomatic and military supporters. So these areas also differ in their recognition by the international community. As discussed maybe earlier, I mentioned this. This is a crucial point to consider because the recognition has crafted the response of many humanitarian organizations, including the UN itself. The other thing I wanted to shed light on is the dynamics of the humanitarian assistance itself. Since the beginning of the conflict in 2011, international humanitarian assistance hasn't been protected from systematic corruption, weaponization, politicization, and diversion by almost always the Assad regime in Damascus. What has made the situation worse is the interpretation of the guiding principles of the UN. As I mentioned earlier, for example, one of these guiding principles is to respect the sovereignty of the state concerned. Based on this misinterpretation of this principle, the UN, for example, operates only under the umbrella of the Assad regime in Damascus, and only with its consent. In other words, if the UN wants to provide humanitarian assistance to the millions of victims of the Assad regime, they need to go through Assad regime itself, through the perpetrators themselves. And this is crazy. We need to find solution for this. Over the last 10 years, the UN has documented countless human rights violations, war crimes, and crimes against the humanity. There are tons of reports, produced by the UN, but at the end of the day, they're still delivering billions of dollars, I'm talking about a huge amount of funds here. For example, the Western contributions alone has exceeded $40 billion in the last decade. $40 billion went directly to Assad regime, and most probably, this money has been used to kill people.
Yeah. So thanks, Tayseer. Can you just finish last sentence?
Yes.
Before?
Okay. So I will stop here. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So we wanted to go back to Joma. You wanted to say something additional about economic sanctions.
Yes, thank you again. Very brief point. We have noticed a kind of improvement in the Syrian pound value opposite to dollar because of the donation, because of the aid coming, etc. So what is being said by the Syrian discourse of lifting the sanctions because people are dying of the lack of aid is this is defying this theory, and no single cross-line shipment. So there is aid coming from Turkey already through the UN mechanism or pipeline from Bab al-Hawa, which is the main brigade in the province of Hatay to northwest of Syria. But there was also before, in every renewal of the cross-border, which mainly lasts for 1 year or 6 months duration, there's also a cross-line shipment. They were scheduled to cross from the UN hub in Damascus to the northwest. This used to be before the earthquake, but till today, there was no single shipment crossing from that gate, which shows the will of the Syrian regime that he wants to abandon this area, no single aid item to go there. And there was some visitors from UN delegates and also Western countries or Arab diplomats who visited Syria to show and market for the rubble and destruction and the impact of this catastrophe on political gain. Again, I want to highlight most of the Syrians here are living below poverty line. Most of them are relying on aid, and this assistance is really life-saving. So without having more doors, more gates to go and bring aid to Northwest Syria, this area will suffer more.
Yeah. Thank you, Juma. We are quickly running out of time, but I was wondering whether Fulya or Evan or both of them could quickly talk to the political context in Turkey and the sort of given, you know, the upcoming elections. And one of the things that I think we've been reading about is the fact that several people have been arrested in terms of construction work. And there's a question, you know, are these the scapegoats? Will this appease the population, or is there sort of a bigger question around the responsibility of the state? And I was wondering if any of you would be happy and willing to say something about the political context, especially in relation to the construction situation. Fulya, would you like to say?
Yeah, sure. And I'll be sure to leave enough space for Evan. So there are lawyer organizations, bars, unions of bars, Contemporary Lawyers Association, Lawyers for Freedom Association. So these are all coordinating and conducting the official complaints on the responsible institutions and construction companies behind the ruined places. But one of their aims is to file complaints against the more powerful politicians as well, not just the construction companies. So there are lawyer organizations who are doing their best to not let this alone and not just, you know, find these scapegoats and punish them and leave the politicians aside. And I can talk more after Evan's point.
Evan, would you want to say something to this question? Can you put on your camera, please? Would you mind?
Yes.
Thanks.
Maybe I can say something about like, yeah, all these centralizations and yeah. One of the question is also past 10 years, the government has repeatedly granted zoning amnesties. Actually, in the many places, contractors have strengthened and their relations of interest with local governments. And instead of an accountable system, mistakes have been covered up with the patches for many years. Even during the pandemic, we have seen an amnesty law was introduced for prisoners on the grounds of illness, but it was only applied for the judicial prisoners, not political prisoners. So were excluded from this amnesty lots of prisoners. In other words, thieves and murderers who committed crimes against the individuals and society were pardoned. So this system of amnesty and impunity encouraged the criminals to commit new crimes. So today, again, hundreds of buildings in center of Diyarbakir are heavily damaged, but yeah, so probably they will pardon it again, and just because of the election, and this is a systematic problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Evan. So I think that we've run out of time. What we want to do, though, is, well, first of all, I'd like to ask you all to put on your camera so that we can see you all for a moment. Juma, if you don't mind, and Tayseer, if you could also put on your cameras for a couple of minutes before we finish. Juma and Tayseer, do you think you can put on your cameras?
Yeah, the host need to open it.
Actually, I'm not allowed. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, I've learned a lot from you. I do hope that our audience learned from you, and also we would like to share with you in a moment a resource page or the link to a resource page that Adam and his team kindly put together that provides links to organizations that have been suggested by panelists and other trusted colleagues. Obviously, there are lots of organizations. We know that some organizations are, we know that with some organizations there is a greater risk that the money goes into the wrong pockets, but we're hoping that the ones that we provided are credible organizations. So we very much encourage you. As Fulya stated, though, you know, this is a situation both in Turkey and Syria where, yes, of course, a one-off donation is important, but what really is needed is more long-term sustainable assistance. Of course, in addition to also political pressure, as we learned from all participants. So I'd like to take the occasion now to thank you all and to also express my appreciation for the work that you're doing in these very difficult circumstances, and also share my solidarity. Adam, did you want to say a few words as well?
Thank you to all our panelists for joining us from so far away and for your excellent perspectives, and both to our panelists and also our audience. If you have other suggestions about resources we can add to our resource page, we're always open to those. So please feel free to send us an email at chrhs@brown.edu, and we'd be happy to add to that page. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.